What if I told you America didn't become the world's most powerful country just because it won World War II? That sounds crazy, doesn't it? Because in 1945, almost everyone agreed on one thing. The war was over, but the fight for the future had only just begun. Europe was shattered. Britain was drowning in debt. Germany and Japan lay in ruins. And across Eastern Europe, one man was quietly expanding his influence. His name was Joseph Stalin. At that moment, many believed the Soviet Union, not America, would dominate the second half of the 20th century. So how did the United States end up becoming the world's only superpower? The answer wasn't just brilliant American strategy. It was also a series of costly mistakes made by others. Mistakes that looked like victories at the time, but slowly handed America more allies, more wealth, and more global influence than any nation had ever possessed. And the first mistake happened before most people even realized a new war had already begun. The war was over, but peace didn't last very long. While most of Europe was trying to rebuild, Joseph Stalin was busy building something else. A buffer zone. One by one, countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet control. To Stalin, it was simple. Russia had been invaded through Eastern Europe more than once. He believed friendly or controlled neighboring states would protect the Soviet Union from another attack. From his perspective, it made sense. But to the United States and Western Europe, it looked very different. It looked like the beginning of a new empire. Fear spread quickly. If Stalin stopped at Eastern Europe, maybe there was nothing to stop him from moving farther west. That fear changed everything. Countries that had spent centuries competing with one another suddenly had a common concern. Instead of standing alone, they began looking across the Atlantic to America, and Washington saw an opportunity. Not to conquer Europe, but to lead it. Within a few years, that fear would give birth to one of the most powerful military alliances in history, an alliance that still exists today. But Stalin's next decision would push America even closer to becoming the leader of the free world. Imagine you've just survived the worst war in history. Your city is in ruins. There are no jobs. Food is scarce. Winter is coming. In moments like these, people don't just need hope, they need help. America understood something that many leaders overlooked. A desperate nation is easy to influence. If Europe's economies collapsed, millions might turn to communist parties that promised stability and change. That wasn't just a humanitarian crisis, it was a strategic one. So in 1947, the United States made a bold move. Instead of demanding land or reparations, it offered money. A lot of it. More than $13 billion in aid, worth well over $150 billion today. This became known as the Marshall Plan. Factories reopened. Railways were rebuilt. Businesses came back to life. Western Europe recovered far faster than many expected. But here's the twist. The Soviet Union didn't just reject the plan. It pressured the countries under its influence to reject it too. What seemed like a show of strength ended up deepening the economic divide between East and West. One side was rebuilding, the other was falling behind, and that gap would grow larger with every passing year. But the next mistake wouldn't be about money. It would be about trying to match America's military power at any cost. Imagine having a rival so powerful that every time they build one missile, you feel forced to build two. That was the reality of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union became locked in a competition unlike anything the world had ever seen. More nuclear weapons, more bombers, more submarines, more rockets. Neither side wanted to appear weak. But there was one crucial difference. The American economy was built on private businesses, innovation, and global trade. It was enormous, and it could better absorb the massive costs of military spending. The Soviet economy was different. The government controlled nearly everything. As defense spending grew, fewer resources were left for everyday life. Factories struggled to produce consumer goods. Store shelves were often empty. People waited in long lines for basic necessities. The Soviet Union looked powerful from the outside, But inside, the cracks were beginning to show. Ironically, the race meant to prove Soviet strength was quietly draining the very system it was supposed to protect. And while Moscow poured its wealth into weapons, America was investing in something that would shape the future in a very different way. The next move wouldn't be fought with tanks or missiles. It would be fought with technology, innovation, and ideas. You might think the story ends here. The Soviet Union is struggling. America is pulling ahead. Game over. Not even close. Because the next battle wasn't fought on the battlefield. It was fought in laboratories, universities, and research centers. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. For a moment, it looked as if America had fallen behind. The launch terrified Washington. If the Soviets could send a satellite into space, could they also send a nuclear missile across the globe? Instead of panicking, the United States responded with something unexpected. It invested heavily in science, engineering, and education. New research programs were launched. Universities received billions in funding. NASA was created. The space race became more than a race to the moon. It became a race to invent the future. Many of the technologies we rely on today, from advanced computing to satellite communications, were accelerated by this competition. The Soviet Union won the first headline, but America built an innovation ecosystem that continued producing breakthroughs for decades. And then the Soviet leadership made a decision that would prove far more costly than anyone imagined. A decision that turned into their own version of Vietnam. The Soviet Union believed it was launching a quick military operation. Its leaders expected the mission to be over in weeks. Instead, they walked into a war that would last nearly 10 years. Afghanistan wasn't like the battlefields of Europe. Towering mountains, narrow valleys, and fierce local resistance turned every advance into a struggle. The Soviet army could capture cities, but controlling the countryside was another story. Then the United States saw an opportunity. Rather than sending American soldiers, Washington supplied money, intelligence, and weapons to Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen. Support also came from countries including Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. The war became painfully expensive. Thousands of Soviet soldiers lost their lives. Billions of rubles disappeared into a conflict with no clear end. Back home, people began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were their sons dying in a distant country? Why was the economy getting worse? The Soviet Union had entered Afghanistan to strengthen its influence. Instead, it exposed its weaknesses to the entire world. Looking back, many historians compare Afghanistan to America's experience in Vietnam, not because the wars were identical, but because both became long, costly conflicts that strained a superpower's resources and confidence. And, while Soviet forces were fighting in the mountains, something even more dangerous was happening inside the Soviet Union itself. The greatest threat wasn't outside its borders anymore. It was growing from within. For decades, the Soviet Union looked unstoppable. It had one of the world's largest armies, thousands of nuclear weapons, and influence across half of Europe. From the outside, it looked like a giant. But inside, the foundation was beginning to crack. The economy had slowed to a crawl. Factories struggled to keep up. Stores often lacked basic goods. Meanwhile, military spending remained enormous, placing even more pressure on an already strained system. In 1985, a new leader came to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. He knew something had to change. So he introduced two major reforms, perestroika to restructure the economy, and glasnost to allow greater openness and public discussion. His goal wasn't to destroy the Soviet Union. It was to save it. But the reforms had an unexpected effect. As people gained more freedom to speak, long-suppressed frustrations came pouring out. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments began to fall. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. It wasn't just a wall of concrete. It was the symbol of an entire era collapsing before the world's eyes. Just 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The Cold War was over. For the first time in modern history, the United States stood as the world's only superpower. But here's the twist. America's rise wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a completely new one, and its lessons still shape the world today. It's tempting to look at history and say, America won because everyone else made mistakes. But history is rarely that simple. Yes, the Soviet Union made costly decisions. Its expanding control over Eastern Europe united America's allies. Rejecting Western economic cooperation widened the gap between East and West. The arms race strained its economy, and the war in Afghanistan exposed weaknesses it could no longer hide. But those mistakes alone didn't make America a superpower. The United States also had unique advantages. Its homeland escaped the destruction that devastated Europe and Asia. Its industries were booming. Its universities attracted talent from around the world. Its alliances expanded across Europe and Asia, and its economy encouraged innovation on a scale few countries could match. History isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about recognizing opportunities when they appear. After World War II, America did exactly that. It turned economic strength into global influence, technology into leadership, and alliances into lasting power. Today the world is changing again. New powers are rising. Old rivalries are returning. The question isn't whether history will repeat itself. It's who will learn from it, and who will repeat the mistakes that changed the world once before. If history teaches us anything, it's this. Superpowers aren't built in a single victory. They're shaped by the choices they make, and by the mistakes their rivals fail to see, until it's too late. Because in history, the biggest winners are often the ones who recognize opportunity when everyone else is making mistakes.